Touch her again." The cowboy said, his voice so quiet it cut through the noise of the entire train platform. "And they'll bury what's left of you." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The drunk ranch hand still had his fingers wrapped around the woman's wrist, but his face had gone the color of old ash the moment Rhett Callahan crossed that platform in 4 long strides. Because every man in Dry Creek, Arizona knew one truth without needing to be taught it twice. When Rhett Callahan spoke that low, you were already standing at the edge of something you could not come back from. If this story already has your heart subscribed to our channel, hit that notification bell and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning and find out what kind of woman makes a man like Rhett Callahan forget every wall he ever built. The 11:40 train out of Tucson arrived 7 minutes late into Dry Creek. 7 minutes during which the entire population of the town, or at least the portion of it, with nothing better to do on a Thursday afternoon, had already assembled along the platform with the particular energy of people who had decided in advance that they were about to witness something worth talking about. Word traveled fast in a town with only one saloon, one general store, and not nearly enough rain. A mail-order bride was coming. That was enough. Mabel Pruitt, who ran the laundry on First Street and considered herself the keeper of Dry Creek's moral record, had already told 6 separate women that morning what she thought of the entire arrangement. "Respectable women don't answer newspaper advertisements," she said, pressing the same collar she'd been pressing for 20 minutes, because pressing gave her hands something to do while her mouth worked. "Respectable women have fathers and brothers and community standing. They don't ship themselves across the country like dry goods." The 6 women who heard this all nodded with the conviction of people who had never once questioned what Mabel Pruitt said, which was exactly the kind of audience Mabel had spent 30 years carefully cultivating. By the time the train whistle screamed its arrival, there were nearly 40 people gathered along the platform. Not to welcome anyone, to watch. There is a particular cruelty to public spectacle that dresses itself up as simple curiosity. The people of Dry Creek had convinced themselves they were merely interested, merely present, merely, as Hector Grimes, the feed store owner, would later say, taking the air. But the truth lived in the way they angled their bodies toward the train doors, in the way conversations dropped to murmurs the moment the first passengers began stepping down, in the way eyes sharpened and lips pressed together, ready to find exactly what they expected to find. And then Adeline Brooks stepped off the train. She carried one suitcase, worn brown leather with a broken brass clasp that she held shut with her left hand pressed flat against the side. She wore a gray traveling dress that had once been a finer shade of blue, the kind of dress that had seen better days, but had been maintained with the kind of careful, stubborn dignity that costs a woman nothing except everything. Her hair was pinned neatly, her chin was level, and her eyes, the moment she cleared the bottom step and felt the weight of 40 strangers staring at her, did not drop. That was the first thing Rhett Callahan noticed. Not her face, not the dress, not the suitcase held shut by sheer will. Her eyes stayed level. He stood at the far end of the platform, 20 feet back from the crowd, arms crossed, hat pulled low. He had placed the advertisement 6 weeks ago at the recommendation of his younger sister Clara, who had told him with characteristic bluntness that a man running 8,000 acres of cattle land and terrorizing half the territory could not continue living alone without eventually becoming something worse than feared. He had not wanted to do it. He had done it anyway. Because Clara was the only person alive whose opinion he'd been unable to entirely stop caring about. He had expected he wasn't sure what he had expected. Something easier to categorize. Something that would confirm his private suspicion that this had been a mistake, and he could write a brief apology letter, and everyone could return to their lives. He had not expected this. He had not expected a woman who walked through 40 silent, staring strangers with her spine straight and her jaw set and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, like she had decided before she ever arrived that whatever this town thought of her was not going to matter. He watched her scan the platform, methodical, careful, looking for the man who had placed the advertisement. He hadn't moved yet. He wasn't sure why. Then Cleet Dawson, one of his own hired hands, which would later cost Cleet his position at the ranch and a great deal of his dignity, stepped out of the group near the water barrel. Cleet had been drinking since before noon, which was not unusual for Cleet. What was unusual was that he decided to make it everyone else's problem. He reached out and grabbed Adeline's wrist. "Well," he said loud enough for the whole platform to hear him grinning, the particular grin of a man who thinks an audience makes him funnier. "Let's get a look at the merchandise before the boss makes up his mind." The laughter that started around him died almost instantly. Because Rhett Callahan was already moving. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He covered the distance in deliberate, unhurried strides that were somehow worse than running the stride of a man who was absolutely certain of what he was about to do, and had no reason to rush, because the outcome was already decided. He put one hand on Cleet's shoulder, spun him around, and drove him back against the wooden post, hard enough to rattle the platform awning. His voice when he spoke was quiet enough that only Cleet and Adeline and the nearest handful of people could hear him clearly. "Touch her again," Rhett said, "and they'll bury what's left of you." Cleet's face had gone slack. The grin was gone entirely. His fingers had released her wrist without him consciously deciding to release it. Rhett held him against the post for another 2 full seconds, long enough to make the message permanent, and then stepped back. He turned toward Adeline, and this was the second thing he noticed. She was not crying. She was not shaking. She was standing exactly where she had been standing, the suitcase still pressed against her side, watching him with an expression he couldn't immediately name. Not gratitude, not relief. Something more complicated than either. Something closer to the careful assessing look of a woman who has been rescued by men before and has learned that rescue and danger are not always different things. He understood that look in a way he could not have explained. "Miss Brooks," he said. "Mr. Callahan," she said back. Her voice was steady. He glanced at her suitcase. "That all you brought?" "Everything worth bringing," she said. He nodded once, turned toward the wagon. "Come on," he said. "You're home now." The ride from the station to the Canyon Ranch took the better part of an hour, and they spent most of it in silence. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind of silence that happens between two people who are both asking the same question, "What did I get myself into?" and have independently decided that the answer can wait until they've had a chance to think. Adeline sat on the wagon bench with her suitcase balanced across her knees and watched the Arizona landscape open up around them, red rock and scrub brush, and a sky so wide and blue it felt like an accusation after years of Chicago's crowded gray. She said nothing. He said nothing. He was aware of her in the way you become aware of something unfamiliar placed in a space you'd thought you knew entirely. The way a new sound in a silent house makes you recalibrate every assumption. She was not what he had expected. He didn't know yet whether that was good or bad. After about 20 minutes without looking at him, she said, "How many people work the ranch?" 14, he said. 15 counting you. A pause. "What would I count as?" He glanced over. "Whatever you decide you are." She looked at him then. Really looked. The same assessing quality from the platform. That's not a typical answer from a man who placed a marriage advertisement. "I'm not a typical man. So I've heard." She looked away again. "They told me things about you in the letters from town, before I came." "I imagine they did." "They said you killed 3 men in the war." 2, he said. "The third one lived. I made sure of it." She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" He kept his eyes on the trail. "Because he had children, and dead fathers make hard lives for children." A beat. I'd already made enough hard lives for people. She didn't respond to that. But he felt something in the air between them shift slightly, like a door that had been held firm, moving an inch on its hinges. The ranch hands were assembled near the main house when they arrived, not officially, not by his order, but in the way that workers always find reasons to be visible when something new is happening. Adeline climbed down from the wagon before he could offer a hand, and stood in the yard looking at the house, the outbuildings, the corrals, with the same methodical attention she'd applied to the train platform. A boy of about 10 years old darted around the corner of the barn, stopped dead when he saw her, and stared. "You the bride?" he demanded. "Eli." Rhett's voice carried a single note of warning. The boy ignored it. He was 9 years old and had not yet developed an adequate respect for single notes of warning. "Are you?" "Because Mr. Callahan said you were coming, but he said it like he was talking about a fence repair and not a—" "Eli." "I'm Adeline," she said to the boy crouching down to his eye level without hesitation. "What's your name?" "Eli Cooper. My pa worked here until he got thrown from a horse last spring. Mr. Callahan lets me stay." He said this last part in a tone that communicated both gratitude and a complete refusal to make it sound like gratitude. "That was good of him," she said. "He's not so bad," Eli said with the critical authority of a 9-year-old who has done extensive research. "He's mean to people who deserve it and regular to everyone else. Most people only know the mean part." Adeline glanced up at Rhett, who was standing 3 feet away, with the expression of a man who deeply regretted every moment that had led to this particular exchange. "Good to know," she said. Bahiyuk, Clara Callahan found her that first evening in the kitchen attempting to understand the wood stove, which was a particular vintage of ornery that required specific knowledge to operate without incident. Clara was 26, small and sharp-featured, and possessed of an opinion on every subject living or theoretical which she shared freely and without apology. She had been managing the domestic operations of the ranch since she was 17. She had placed the marriage advertisement in the newspaper herself, using Rhett's name, before informing him that she'd done it. The subsequent argument had lasted 4 days and ended when Clara pointed out that she couldn't be responsible for his social isolation indefinitely, and that he owed it to himself to stop treating loneliness like a virtue. He had never entirely forgiven her. He was also aware that she had been right. "You're fighting it," Clara said from the doorway. Adeline looked up. "I beg your pardon?" "The stove. It doesn't respond to fighting." Clara crossed the kitchen, made 2 small adjustments to the damper and the draft, and the stove caught cleanly. "It responds to patience. Everything out here does." Adeline looked at the stove, then at Clara. "He didn't mention a sister. He doesn't mention much. I placed the advertisement." A silence. "He knows," Clara said. He was furious. Then he accepted it. That's basically Rhett's entire emotional range: furious, then accepted. She studied Adeline with the same directness that seemed to be a Callahan family trait. "You're not what I expected." "I keep hearing that." "I expected someone frightened." "I was frightened," Adeline said. "I'm tired of being frightened. There's a difference." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, there is." And something in her tone shifted from assessment into something closer to recognition. "Supper's at 7. The hands eat first, then us. That's always been the order here." She turned to leave. "Miss Callahan," Adeline said. Clara stopped. "Thank you," Adeline said, "for placing the advertisement." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me if it works." The first week was a study in careful distance. Rhett was not cold, but he was deliberate. He did not crowd her, did not demand conversation, did not treat the arrangement as settled merely because she had arrived. He showed her the ranch in sections: the north pasture where the main herd grazed, the creek trail that ran along the canyon wall and was the safest ride in the territory, the supply room that she was free to manage however she found useful. He gave her things to do, but never orders. He explained, but never commanded. And every morning, without exception, before she was awake, he left a cup of coffee outside her bedroom door. She noticed the coffee on the 3rd morning. She mentioned it on the 5th. "You don't have to do that," she told him at breakfast. He looked up from his plate. "Do what?" "The coffee." He held her gaze for a moment. Does it bother you? No, she said. I'm not used to it. Getting used to things takes time, he said, and went back to his breakfast. But she sat there another moment holding the cup, thinking about a man who ran 8,000 acres of cattle land and had a reputation that made grown men step aside, leaving coffee outside a stranger's door every morning without asking for anything in return. She filed that information carefully. In the part of her mind where she kept the things that were trying to change what she believed about the world. The trouble started on the 10th day. She had ridden into town with Clara for supplies, her first time back in Dry Creek since the train platform, and the silence that greeted them on the main street was a different kind than the open desert. This silence had corners, had eyes. She heard it when she passed two women outside the milliner's. She caught the tail end of it, the last few words, before the voices dropped. Probably made up everything in those letters. Women like that always. She kept walking. Inside the general store, the owner, a man named Fletcher, who had the particular manner of someone who has decided that business and contempt can comfortably coexist, weighed her flour purchase in a long, pointed silence before saying as he slid the bag across the counter, "You planning on staying then?" "That's my intention," she said. Callahan's had hired women at the ranch before. He said with a deliberateness that left no doubt about what kind of hired women he meant. Clara, who had been examining bolts of fabric across the room, set down the bolt she was holding with a precise, controlled motion that communicated the full weight of her opinion without a single syllable. Adeline looked Fletcher directly in the eyes for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Add a pound of sugar to the order," and walked to the other side of the store. Fletcher opened his mouth, closed it, decided correctly that this particular battle had already been lost. Later, outside, Clara walked beside her in silence for half a block before saying, "You didn't flinch." "I've had practice," Adeline said. Clara looked at her sideways. "What kind of practice?" Adeline shifted the supply bag on her arm. "The kind you'd rather not have." Clara didn't push, but she remembered. Jeg. He found out about it that evening. Not from Adeline, she said nothing. Not from Clara, she reported it factually without editorial, which in Clara's vocabulary was the equivalent of full editorial. He heard the core of it from Eli, who had apparently been outside the general store at the relevant moment, and possessed the 9-year-old's complete inability to leave important information unshared. Rhett said nothing at dinner that night. The next morning, he rode into Dry Creek alone. He was in Fletcher's store for less than 5 minutes. No one who witnessed the conversation would repeat it in detail for several months afterward. But Fletcher, for the remainder of Adeline's time in Dry Creek, addressed her as Mrs. Callahan, and weighed her flour with exacting precision, and never said another word that had corners to it. Adeline noticed. She said nothing to Rhett about it. But when he left his coffee outside her door the next morning, she was already awake, and she sat with it in her hands for longer than usual in the quiet of the early morning, listening to the ranch begin its day around her, thinking about what it meant when a dangerous man directed all that danger outward, away from her, between her and everything that would hurt her. She had not been someone's priority in a very long time. The sensation was so unfamiliar that she initially misidentified it, catalogued it as suspicion, as wariness, as the reasonable caution of a woman who had learned that kindness always came with a bill attached. But sitting with that coffee in the early light, she began to consider carefully, reluctantly, with every defense she had still firmly in place, that this might be something different. "Why did you really agree to this?" she asked him that night. They were on the porch after supper, not sitting together exactly, but both present the way two people find themselves occupying the same space without having planned it. The Arizona night had the particular quality of a place that has no patience for pretense. Too big and too quiet for anything less than honesty. Rhett was quiet for a moment. "Clara arranged it," he said. "That's not what I asked." Another pause. He looked out at the darkness past the corrals. "I've been alone a long time," he said finally. "Not the practical kind. The other kind." She understood that. She understood it in the way you can only understand something by having lived it. "Did you think it would work?" she asked. "A marriage advertisement." "No," he said honestly. "I thought it would fail quietly, and I could tell Clara I tried." She almost smiled. Almost. And now, he turned and looked at her. Then the same direct quality she'd noticed from the very beginning. The way he looked at things, he was trying to understand, rather than the way men usually looked at women, which was to say, he was actually looking at her. "Now I think quiet failure might not be as available as I expected." The almost smile became real. Small, still guarded, but real. It was the first time he'd seen it. He stored it away with the private, slightly alarmed recognition of a man who has just discovered a new vulnerability and is not sure what to do with it. Say, she found the gloves on the 14th morning, new ones left on the table beside her coffee. Good leather. Her size, though she'd never told him her size. Brown, practical, nothing decorative about them. Work gloves. Her hands went still for a moment. She had been wearing gloves since she arrived. She wore them to breakfast, wore them around the ranch, wore them with a consistency that a man paying attention might have noticed, signified something beyond fashion. She had not thought he was paying that kind of attention. She sat down slowly, pulled off the old gloves, looked at her hands in the morning light. The marks that had faded to yellow-green at the edges, but had not yet disappeared entirely. The shadows that spoke a history she had not told anyone. She put on the new gloves, picked up her coffee, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, cried so quietly that no one heard her. Jesh. That evening she walked out to the corral where he was working with a young horse and stood at the fence without speaking for several minutes. He didn't stop what he was doing, but she could tell he knew she was there. Finally, she said, "The gloves." He kept working. "You didn't ask," she said. "No. Most people ask." "Most people," he said, running his hand along the horse's neck, "are more interested in the story than in whether you want to tell it." She gripped the top rail of the fence and looked at the horse, not at him. "I came here to start over," she said, "not to explain." "Then don't explain," he said simply. "You don't owe anyone here your history." She looked at him then. "Including you." He turned and met her eyes across the fence. Something moved through his expression. Something careful and deliberate, like a man choosing his words with full understanding of their weight. "Including me," he said. "When you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here. But I'll be here either way." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked away back at the horse, back at the wide, dark canyon beyond, and she did not say anything else. But she stayed at the fence for another hour. And when she finally went inside, she noticed that she had stopped holding her shoulders the way she'd been holding them since Chicago braced pulled forward ready. She stood up straight. She hadn't noticed she'd stopped until she started again. And in the corrals, Rhett Callahan watched her walk toward the house and understood with the quiet, unwelcome certainty of a man who has spent years avoiding exactly this, that he was already in serious trouble. Not the kind he knew how to fight. The kind that had already gotten past every defense he had in a gray traveling dress with a worn suitcase and eyes that refused to drop on a train platform 10 days ago. The kind that had looked at him and asked, "Who are you?" before he'd said a single word. He turned back to the horse, muttered something under his breath that the horse, to its credit, pretended not to hear. 14 days in Dry Creek. 14 mornings of coffee outside a door. 14 evenings of calculated, cautious distance. And all of it, every wall he'd spent years building and tending and maintaining, already beginning to crack at the foundation. Because the woman who had arrived with everything worth bringing in one worn suitcase was proving to be exactly that. Everything. The nightmares started on the 17th night. Rhett heard it from across the hall, not screaming, which would have been easier to respond to, but something worse. A sound that started low and built without ever becoming loud, the particular sound of someone fighting their way up through something heavy and suffocating. He was out of bed and into the hallway, before he was fully awake, moving on instinct. The way soldiers do, the way men do, who have spent enough time sleeping light, because light sleeping is the difference between living and not. He stopped outside her door. The sound had stopped. He stood there in the dark hallway for a full minute, hand raised, not knocking, listening. Behind the door, there was the quiet of someone sitting awake in the aftermath. He knew that quiet had lived inside it himself for years, and then the careful, controlled sound of breathing, being deliberately slowed. He lowered his hand. He went to the kitchen and put the coffee on instead. When she came out an hour before the rest of the house, she found him at the kitchen table with 2 cups already poured. He didn't look up from the mug in his hands. He didn't say anything about the hour, or the dark circles under her eyes, or the fact that her hair, usually pinned neatly before she left her room, was only half arranged. He pushed the second cup across the table. She sat down and wrapped both hands around it. They sat in silence for 10 minutes. "How long?" she finally asked. She didn't specify. She didn't need to. He looked up. 4 years after the war, he said. Then they got quieter. Now they only come back when something reminds me. She absorbed that. Does it get better? Different, he said honestly. Not always better, but different. She nodded slowly, looked into her cup. I used to think I was weak for not being able to stop them. Weak would have been staying wherever they came from, he said. Something flickered across her face, fast, sharp, quickly controlled, and she looked at him with that measuring quality again, the one he'd come to recognize as Adeline processing information she hadn't expected. You don't know where they came from, she said. No, he agreed. But you're here, which means you left, which isn't what weak looks like. She was quiet again for a long moment. Then, very carefully, like someone opening a door they'd kept locked for a very long time. I was engaged before. In Chicago. His name was Charles Whitmore. Rhett said nothing, kept his expression still, gave her room. He was important, politically. His family had money going back 3 generations, and everyone in our social circle thought I was the luckiest woman alive. Her voice carried no bitterness, just the flat, stripped quality of someone reporting facts they've already processed until all the raw edges are worn smooth. I thought so too, for a while. She stopped. He waited. She shook her head slightly, like closing a door again. Not now, she said. I'm not ready for all of it now. All right, he said. You're not going to push. He picked up his coffee. I told you before, your story's yours. I'll wait. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the early morning dark, and something moved through her expression that she couldn't entirely conceal, something that sat between gratitude and grief, between the relief of being believed and the old practiced suspicion that nothing this steady ever stays. She didn't name it, but she didn't look away from it either. That was its own kind of courage, and he recognized it.
Joan.
The ranch had rhythms, and Adeline learned them the way she'd learned to survive most things, by watching carefully, and then committing fully once she understood the shape of things. She was up before sunrise without being asked. She had opinions about the supply inventory that turned out to be correct, and she voiced them directly without hedging. And when the ranch's head cook, a wiry man named Beaumont, who had been managing the kitchen stores for 11 years and considered them his personal domain, pushed back, she laid out her reasoning with the calm precision of someone who has had to justify herself to rooms full of skeptical men and has stopped finding it anything other than tedious. Beaumont pushed back twice more. Then he stepped aside and let her reorganize the supply room. 3 weeks later, he told Clara, not Adeline, because that would have required him to admit he'd been wrong directly, that the new system was better. Clara told Adeline. Adeline allowed herself exactly half a smile. With the children, she was different. Eli had decided on approximately day 4 that Adeline was acceptable, which in Eli's social hierarchy was the equivalent of a formal knighthood. He brought 2 other ranch children in his wake, a girl named Ruby, whose parents worked the cattle operation, and who was 8 years old and deeply serious about everything, and a 7-year-old boy named Sims, who did not speak much, but watched everything with enormous dark eyes that missed nothing. Adeline taught them to read in the evenings. Not formally, not like a schoolroom, she simply read to them. Good stories, real stories. And when they started asking questions about the words on the page, she answered the questions until they were asking about the words themselves. And then she put the books in their hands and let them figure it out. Rhett noticed. He noticed the way she was with them, patient, but never condescending, honest, but never harsh, and he filed it away in the growing catalog of things about Adeline Brooks that he had not expected and could not stop thinking about. He also noticed the gloves. Every morning. Breakfast to supper, working around the ranch, riding the creek trail. Always gloved. He never mentioned it again. He didn't need to. He'd already said what needed saying. The first real test came 23 days in the form of a man named Vernon Hatch. Vernon owned the neighboring property to the east, or claim to the title on that land, having been disputed for the better part of 2 years, and he had disliked Rhett Callahan with the pure, uncomplicated intensity of a man who has convinced himself that another man's success is the direct cause of his own failures. He rode on to the Callahan ranch unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, which was already a statement, and demanded to speak to Rhett about water rights on the creek boundary. Rhett was in the north pasture and wasn't expected back for an hour. Adeline was in the yard. Vernon looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has decided a woman is an obstacle rather than a person and acted accordingly. "Who are you?" he said, not dismounting. "Adeline Callahan," she said. It was the first time she'd used the name in public. It came out steadier than she'd expected. Vernon's lip curled. "The mail-order wife." He said it like a slur. "Go get your husband. He's out on the property," she said. "I can take a message." "I'm not leaving a message with the hired help." The ranch hands nearby went very still. Beaumont, who had come out of the kitchen door for unrelated reasons, stopped moving entirely. Adeline looked up at Vernon Hatch on his horse and felt the familiar internal shift, the one that happened when a man decided she was beneath consideration and made a decision about how she was going to respond to it. "Mr. Hatch," she said, her voice entirely pleasant, "you're on our property, making demands and insulting the person in front of you, which is a poor strategy by any measure. You can wait for my husband in a civil manner, or you can leave. Those are the options." Vernon's face darkened. "Now you listen here." She said those are the options. Rhett's voice came from behind her. He had come back early. No one had heard him ride in. He moved past Adeline close enough that his arm briefly touched her shoulder, deliberate a statement, and looked up at Vernon with an expression that communicated precisely nothing, which was always more dangerous than anger. Vernon sputtered, recalibrated, attempted to redirect. "Callahan, I want to discuss the eastern creek boundary before summer." "You'll write me a letter," Rhett said, "like every other rancher in the territory. You don't ride onto my land unannounced and speak to my wife that way and expect to conduct business the same afternoon." He paused. "Get off my property, Vernon." Vernon got off the property. Afterward, in the yard, Rhett turned toward Adeline. "You didn't need me to handle that," he said. It was not a question. "No," she agreed. "But you didn't move when I came." She met his eyes. "No," she said again. Something passed between them unspoken, carefully contained on both sides. The acknowledgement of a partnership forming in real time, built from something more complicated and more solid than either of them had planned for when this arrangement began. "Good," he said quietly, and walked back toward the barn. And behind him, Adeline Brooks. Adeline Callahan let out a slow, controlled breath and thought that there might be something to learn from a dangerous man who directs all his danger outward. It was Clara who finally said the thing that both of them were circling. She said it to Adeline on a Wednesday evening with the directness that Clara applied to everything and that Adeline had come to find genuinely refreshing. "He watches you," Clara said. They were in the kitchen after supper, which had become a natural hour for the two of them. The ranch hands dispersed, Rhett usually in the office with the ledgers the children long since run to exhaustion and sleep. When he thinks you're not looking, which is often because you're usually busy actually doing something and he's trying to look like he isn't watching. Adeline kept her hands on what she was doing. "He's cautious," she said. He's terrified, Clara corrected. There's a difference. Cautious men keep distance. Terrified men keep busy. She paused. He fixed the hinge on your bedroom window last week. Adeline looked up. I didn't ask him to. The hinge wasn't broken, Clara said. A silence. He checked, Clara continued, and the hinge was fine. Then 2 days later, it was suddenly in need of repair, and he spent 45 minutes fixing it. She gave Adeline a look of complete, fond exasperation. That man built a reason to stand outside your bedroom window for 45 minutes because he was worried about the latch. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Adeline set down what she was holding, looked at the table. Clara, I'm not telling you what to do with it, Clara said, putting both hands up. I am incapable of minding my own business, but I am not incapable of recognizing when it's appropriate. I'm just making sure you have all available information. Adeline was quiet for a long moment. I'm not in a position to... She started. You don't have to be in any position, Clara said more gently. I'm just saying, he's not the man people think he is, which you've probably figured out. But sometimes people who've been given enough wrong information about themselves need to hear the right information out loud. She picked up her cup. From someone who isn't afraid to say it. Adeline looked at her. I'm not afraid, Adeline said quietly. Clara smiled, small and real and satisfied. No, she said. I know you're not. Get all. She told him the rest of it on a night when the stars were so thick and low, they felt like something a person could reach for. She had been at the ranch 31 days. She knew because she had been counting not with dread, but with a quiet accumulating wonder, the way you count things that keep surprising you by continuing to be good. They were on the porch again. Their porch. She'd started thinking of it that way without deciding to, and she started talking without a preamble, without warning, the way things sometimes release after they've been held long enough. My father had debts, she said. Gambling debts. The kind that don't stay private. Charles Whitmore offered to cover them. All of it, everything settled in exchange for a marriage arrangement. She felt Rhett go very still beside her. They sat across a table, my father and Charles, and they worked out the terms, the number, the timeline. Her voice was even. She had practiced this evenness for a long time. I found the letter, by accident. My father had written a summary of the agreement, and I found it in his desk when I was looking for postage. The night was very quiet. I left the next morning, she said. Before anyone was awake, I took my mother's jewelry, which was legally mine anyway. She'd specified it in her own will, and I sold 3 pieces in a pawn shop and bought a train ticket to St. Louis. Then another to Kansas City. Then I saw the advertisement. She paused. I answered it because the notice said the rancher needed a capable woman and a real partner. Not a quiet wife. Not an obedient arrangement. She looked at her hands. I thought, even if it's wrong, even if this is terrible, at least someone is saying the word partner. Rhett's jaw had gone tight. She could see it from the side. Adeline, he said. His voice was rough at the edges. I'm not telling you because I want you to be angry on my behalf, she said quickly. I'm telling you because you've waited, and I said I'd tell you when I was ready. And she exhaled, I'm ready. He turned toward her fully. They sold you, he said. Not a question. Not loud. But the words carried the specific weight of a man who has fought enough wrong in his life to recognize its particular shape. They tried, she said. I didn't let them finish. He looked at her for a long moment. The fierce, contained quality she'd seen from the very first glance on the platform directed inward now held back something large being deliberately controlled. You said the jewelry was your mother's. Yes. She left it to you specifically. In writing, she paused. She didn't trust my father entirely either. I think she knew something. Not everything, but something. Rhett was quiet. Then, your father. Does he know where you went? Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. He'd have to look first, she said slowly. And looking means admitting I ran, which means admitting why I ran, which means Charles Whitmore, Rhett said. Yes. A silence that had a different texture than the ones before it. A wealthy politician from Chicago, Rhett said, who had an arrangement destroyed by a woman who vanished. When you say it that way, I say it that way because that's what it is. His voice was still quiet, still controlled. But she heard the undercurrent, the thing moving beneath the surface, assessing, calculating. Men like that don't let arrangements fall apart quietly. She had not let herself think this, had refused to think this, had kept 31 miles of Arizona territory between herself and the thought telling herself that distance was enough, that a new name and a new territory and a man with a reputation like Rhett Callahan's was enough. "He doesn't know where I am," she said. Rhett looked at her. The look did not confirm this. The look said something else entirely. Said, "Are you certain? Because I am not certain, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." She thought about it. About Charles Whitmore, who had the kind of connections that came with 3 generations of political money. About her father, who was desperate and had already proven what he would trade for relief from desperation. Her hands went still in her lap. "My father," she said slowly, "knows I came west. He doesn't know exactly where. But if someone with enough resources, if someone asked the right people, or paid them," Rhett said. The porch was very quiet. "I have to think," she said. "We have time," he said. "Tonight." He looked out into the dark. "Tomorrow I'm going to talk to some people." She looked at him. "What kind of people?" "The kind who know when strangers start asking questions in nearby towns." She absorbed this. "You have people like that." "I have people who owe me things," he said. "It amounts to the same." He paused. "You should have told me sooner." It wasn't an accusation. He said it the way someone says something true that is also costly, like it hurts him that she carried it alone this long more than it frustrates him. "I didn't know if I could trust," she started. "I know," he said. "I'm not blaming you. I'm saying from here forward, whatever you know I need to know. Not because you answer to me." He looked at her directly. "Because I can't protect what I'm not informed about. And I intend to protect you." She met his eyes, held them. This was the moment she knew it clearly. The way you know certain moments while they're happening, that something crossed over from temporary to permanent. From arrangement to something that didn't have a cleaner word than his and hers and ours. "All right," she said. He nodded once, looked back at the night. And then, so quietly, it might have been addressed to himself as much as her, "Nobody's selling you, not while I'm standing." She didn't answer, but she stayed on that porch beside him until the stars began to thin toward morning. And neither one of them suggested going in. The next 3 weeks moved differently, not faster. The work of a cattle ranch doesn't adjust its pace for personal revelations, but with a different underlying current. Something had shifted in the architecture of the arrangement. Everyone in the ranch felt it the way animals feel pressure changes before weather arrives. The hands became more careful in small ways. Beaumont started including Adeline in supply decisions without being asked. Clara began treating Adeline less like a guest she was evaluating and more like a sister who needed the full benefit of Clara's extensive unsolicited wisdom on every subject, living or theoretical. And Rhett stopped keeping the careful, deliberate distance. He was still not a demonstrative man. He was not going to become one. But he stopped engineering reasons to be across the room. He stopped managing the space between them with architectural precision. He sat beside her at the table. He rode with her on the creek trail without treating it as a practical lesson in ranch navigation. He asked her opinion on things: the north pasture rotation, the new hand he was considering hiring, whether Eli's increasing boldness with the horses required correction or encouragement. He asked. And he listened to the answers. Not as a courtesy, as someone who actually adjusted based on what he heard. She noticed. She was noticing everything now. The way he spoke to the children, gruff on the surface, but underneath it, a quality of attention that said, "You matter, and your questions matter, and I have time for you," even when he clearly didn't have time. The way he handled the horses with a patience in private that matched nothing of his public reputation. The way he read in the evenings, serious-focused reading real books, history and philosophy and land law, because his mind was continuously, insistently active in ways that had no outlet in the life he'd built around himself. She started reading in the evenings too, in the chair across from him. It was something she'd done in Chicago before. Before the letter, before the choice. It was one of the things she'd thought she'd left behind. The first evening she'd appeared in the sitting room with a book, he looked up from his own and then looked back down without comment. But she saw the slight adjustment in his posture, the way he settled more fully into his chair. Like a man who has been sitting tense and has finally found a reason to relax. She thought about what Clara had said. Terrified men keep busy. She thought about a man who fixed hinges that weren't broken, and she thought about the fact that she had not had a nightmare in 11 days. Not since the morning at the kitchen table, when she'd let herself say Charles Whitmore's name out loud for the first time in months. As if naming the thing had taken some of its power. Or as if sleeping in a house where someone who meant it was paying attention had changed the chemistry of her nights. She didn't examine this too closely. She just slept. It was Eli who broke it open. Eli who had the 9-year-old's gift for arriving at exactly the moment that makes everything complicated. Came into the kitchen one morning where both Adeline and Rhett happened to be separately, independently, both with coffee, which Eli clocked with the alert, suspicious intelligence of a child who notices patterns and said, "Are you two going to get properly married? Or are you just going to keep sitting on the porch?" Beaumont at the stove became very intensely interested in his skillet. Clara from the doorway made no attempt whatsoever to hide her expression. Rhett set down his cup. "Eli," he said. "Because Ruby says that you got married on paper, but that's not the same thing as Eli." "I'm just asking what everyone else is wondering," Eli said with the magnificent indignation of someone who believes that honesty is being penalized unfairly. Adeline looked at the table. She was trying not to smile. She was failing. "What everyone else is wondering," Rhett repeated with the tone of a man whose household has entirely escaped his control and has made peace with this. "The hands have a bet," Eli informed him helpfully. "Beaumont won't tell me what the stakes are, but he keeps checking the calendar." Beaumont's skillet became the single most fascinating object in the Arizona territory. Rhett looked at Adeline. She looked back, and the smile she'd been fighting broke loose, real and unguarded, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes, and he felt the full impact of it like a physical thing right in the center of his chest, where he'd stopped letting things reach him years ago. "Out," he told Eli. "But now." Eli went loudly and with extensive vocal commentary about the general unfairness of adult communication. In the kitchen, the silence that followed was warm at the edges. Adeline looked at him. "A bet," she said. "Apparently. What do you think the stakes are?" He held her eyes. "I think," he said carefully, "that's less important than whether the bet has anything to win." She held his gaze for a long, still moment. "Rhett," she said quietly. His given name easy in her mouth, natural in a way that landed differently than anything had in years. "I know," he said. "I'm not pushing." "You never push," she said. "No. I've noticed that," she said. "I've been noticing it." She looked down at her hands, the new gloves, the good leather worn now, to the shape of her hands, specifically. "I came here running from something. I didn't come here expecting—" She stopped. "I didn't expect you to be who you are." He said nothing. Let her find it. "I'm not running anymore," she said. She looked up, and what she saw in his face behind all the control, all the careful, deliberate restraint, was the answer to a question she hadn't quite managed to ask yet. Something fierce and steady, and entirely, absolutely certain. Something that had been certain, she realized, since a train platform. Since the first glance. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not gloved, her actual hand bare and real over his scarred knuckles. He turned his hand over and held hers. That was all. That was everything. And in the kitchen, Beaumont checked the calendar on the wall and smiled quietly at his skillet and said nothing to anyone. Kai. The letter arrived on a Friday. It came through the Dry Creek post office, addressed in a handwriting she recognized before she'd fully read the name at the bottom. Her body recognized it first, the instinctive pull in her stomach, the cold that started at the base of her spine and moved upward. She opened it in the yard alone. Adeline, you have caused considerable trouble. The arrangement was legal and binding by every standard applicable. I intend to remedy this situation and have retained legal counsel accordingly. I expect your compliance will be infinitely preferable to the alternative. C.W. She stood in the yard with the letter in her hand. 36 days of sleeping better. 36 mornings of coffee and honesty, and a man who checked hinges and gave her gloves and held her hand across a kitchen table. She folded the letter and walked inside to find Rhett, because she was not running anymore, and Charles Whitmore was about to learn what that meant. Rhett read the letter once. He set it on the table between them, flat and deliberate, the way a man sets down something he intends to deal with rather than react to. Then he stood very still for a moment with his hands pressed against the table's edge and his jaw set at the angle Adeline had learned meant he was choosing his words carefully. How long ago was this postmarked? He said. 4 days, she said. It came through the main post. Someone in town signed for it. That meant 4 days of people in Dry Creek knowing that a letter had arrived addressed to Adeline Callahan from a Chicago return address. In a town the size of Dry Creek, that information had traveled to every available ear within the hour. Rhett straightened up. He sent a letter first. He always announces himself, she said. The familiarity in her voice, the specific tired familiarity of someone who knows how another person operates, made his jaw tighten further. He considers it a courtesy, giving you the chance to comply before he applies pressure. And when people don't comply, she met his eyes. He applies pressure. Rhett was quiet for a moment. Then, what kind of legal standing does he actually have? The arrangement, was there anything signed? My father signed something. I didn't. She kept her voice even. My father doesn't have the legal authority to sign a marriage contract on my behalf. I was 24 years old, but Charles has lawyers who can make arguments that take years to untangle in court. She paused. And he has connections with territorial judges. Political connections. That's what he does. He builds leverage with people before he needs to use it. How far ahead does he plan? Far enough, she said. He knew about the debts before my father did, I think. I've always suspected he arranged for the losses, created the desperation, and then arrived with the solution. She looked at her hands. By the time I understood the shape of it, it was already built around me. Rhett absorbed this. The controlled stillness in his posture was doing real work. Now she could see the effort it cost him. He built a trap, he said, and put himself in charge of the only exit, she said. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Rhett said, he's not dealing with your father anymore. It was not a reassurance. It was a statement of fact delivered with the quiet certainty of a man who has spent enough time in difficult situations to know the difference between what can be handled and what cannot. Rhett, write him back, he said. She blinked. I'm sorry. Write him back. Today. Tell him the arrangement he references has no legal standing, that you entered a valid marriage in the Arizona territory of your own free will, and that any further correspondence should be directed to my attorney in Tucson. She stared at him. You have an attorney in Tucson. I will by tomorrow morning, he said. I'm riding at dawn. She opened her mouth and closed it. The speed of it, the complete instant transition from stillness to action, from absorbing information to moving on it, was something she was still learning about him. Rhett Callahan did not sit inside problems. He moved through them. He won't stop at a letter, she said. I know. He looked at her directly. Neither will I. He was back from Tucson by late afternoon the next day with a name, Edward Marsh, one of the best legal minds in the territory, a man who had spent 15 years unpicking fraudulent land contracts and bad faith arrangements. and who, according to Rhett, had never lost a case he'd personally argued. He also came back with information. His contact in Tucson, a man Adeline didn't ask about, and Rhett didn't explain, had confirmed what Rhett already suspected. Someone had been making inquiries in 3 separate towns along the rail line, asking about a woman matching Adeline's description who had traveled west. Asking with money behind the questions, which meant the answers were not difficult to find. "He already knows where you are," Rhett said. She had known this was coming since she read the letter, but hearing it said clearly still landed with weight. When? My guess. He knew before the letter arrived. The letter was the announcement, not the search. He sat across from her. He's not asking where you are anymore. He's establishing the record, making it look like he's giving you the chance to return voluntarily, so that when he arrives, whatever he does next looks like a man exercising legal recourse rather than hunting me, she said. Yes. Clara had come in partway through this and was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and the expression of a woman doing rapid strategic calculations. "What does he want?" she said. "Truly, is it her? Or is it something else?" Adeline looked at her hands. "My mother's estate," she said quietly. "The pieces I didn't sell, the property, the holdings my mother left specifically to me in her will. It's not a small amount. Charles needed it to cover political investments that haven't paid out the way he expected." She paused. "He needs the money, and he needs it tied to a wife, so that it transfers under marriage law rather than requiring contested probate. So he needs you married to him," Clara said flatly. "Legally. On paper. Yes." "What happens to the money if you're married to Rhett?" "It stays mine," Adeline said. "Under my own name, in my own right. My mother's will was specific about that too." She looked up. She was a very careful woman. Clara looked at Rhett. Something passed between them, the shorthand of siblings who have been reading each other for 20 years. "He's going to contest the marriage," Clara said. "I know," Rhett said. "He's going to come here and make it ugly. I know that too. Rhett, I know Clara." The words were quiet and final. Not dismissive, she'd learned that from him too, the difference between quiet that shuts a door and quiet that simply names something. This was the second kind. He knew exactly what was coming. He had already accepted it. He was already past the part where most men would still be arguing about whether it was real. He looked at Adeline. "Are you afraid?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said, "but not the way I used to be afraid." "What's different?" She met his eyes. "I'm not alone this time." And Charles Whitmore arrived in Dry Creek on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the letter, in a hired coach from the Tucson rail station with 2 lawyers and a man whose purpose was never explicitly stated, but who wore a suit that didn't quite fit over shoulders that were built for different work. He was handsome. Adeline had always conceded that. Dark-haired, well-dressed, with the particular ease of movement of a man who has never in his life walked into a room and wondered whether he belonged in it. He had a smile that arrived before it needed to the practiced warmth of a politician who had turned charm into infrastructure. She watched him step down from the coach from across the street through the window of the general store where she had been discussing autumn supply orders with Fletcher when someone called out that a fancy coach had come in from Tucson. She stood very still. Fletcher looked at her face, and then at the coach, and back at her face, and said nothing, which was the most useful thing Fletcher had done in recent memory. Charles hadn't seen her yet. He was surveying Dry Creek with the expression of a man doing a rapid dismissive assessment, cataloging the town size, its limitations, its distance from anything that mattered to him, and already finding it insufficient. She walked out the back door of the store. She was at the ranch within the hour. Rhett was already there. One of the hands had ridden ahead. He was standing in the yard when she came in fast, and the look on his face when he saw her, the particular alert scanning quality that she'd come to understand as his version of concern, was the look of a man checking that she was whole. "He's here," she said. "I know. He has lawyers, and someone else. A man who—" "I know that too." He'd already had word. Of course he had. Marsh is riding in from Tucson this evening. Until he arrives, we don't do anything that can be used against us. He looked at her carefully. How are you? I'm fine. Adeline. I am fine, she said more deliberately. I'm not going to fall apart because he arrived. I knew he was coming. She paused. I'm angry, actually. More than anything. I'm angry that he followed me here. That men like him always believe that a woman who leaves is a problem to be solved rather than a person who made a decision. Rhett looked at her for a moment. Then, good. Stay angry. Anger is useful. Fear isn't. You sound like you've thought about this before. I have, he said simply. War teaches you that. Charles made his first public move the next morning. He held court at the saloon, which was the only place in Dry Creek large enough to hold the audience he intended, and he spoke with the measured authority of a man who has prepared for this performance, with the same care he applied to every room where he needed to control the narrative. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He told the assembled population of Dry Creek that he was a political representative from the state of Illinois, that he had come west with considerable personal difficulty to locate a woman who had been removed from her home under false pretenses, and that he had serious legal concerns about the circumstances of her current. He paused here, allowing the pause to do its work arrangement. He used the word arrangement 3 times. He expressed sympathy for the townspeople who had no doubt been misled. He expressed concern for the woman herself, whom he described as vulnerable and impressionable and in need of protection. He referenced the marriage advertisement with a tone of sorrowful implication that stopped just short of an accusation, because stopping just short of an accusation is the technique of a man who wants the damage without the accountability. By noon, Dry Creek had divided, not cleanly, not evenly, but audibly. Mabel Pruitt, who had never adjusted her initial assessment of Adeline, found in Charles Whitmore a confirmation of everything she'd suspected from the moment that gray traveling dress had stepped off the train. She told 6 women. Those women told others. On the other side, the ranch hands who had watched Adeline for 5 weeks and formed their own conclusions. Beaumont, who would say nothing publicly, but whose silence carried its own statement. Clara, who was not silent at all, who walked directly into the saloon while Charles was still talking and stood at the back with her arms folded and her expression broadcasting the specific contempt of a woman who has no patience for carefully constructed lies dressed up as concern. Charles saw her. He didn't acknowledge her. Smart enough to recognize that engaging Clara Callahan in a public forum was not a battle he was likely to win. Rhett conspicuously did not go to the saloon. Adeline found him in the office when she came back from town with the report of what had happened delivered by Clara, in the loaded, precise language of someone who wanted the record to be accurate. He was sitting at his desk reading a document, Marsh's initial brief, she realized, scanning the top of the page. He called you a manipulator, she said, in those specific words. I know. He implied the advertisement was fraudulent. I know. He said I'm vulnerable. She said the word with the particular inflection of someone putting a thing down that they've been carrying at arm's length. He said it like it was a kindness. Rhett looked up from the brief. What do you want to do? She met his eyes. I want to walk into the next room where Charles is speaking and tell every person in that room exactly what he is. She paused. But I know that's not the right move. No, he said. It's not yet. He leaned back. Marsh arrives tonight. We let him look at what Charles has filed. We respond through proper channels, first loudly enough that when this goes, the way Charles intends it to go, everyone in the territory knows we tried the right way. And when it goes the wrong way anyway, he held her gaze. Then we stop being polite. Edward Marsh was a compact, precise man in his 50s, who spoke sparingly and listened with the focused intensity of someone who was billing by the hour and intended to justify every cent of it. He sat at the ranch table that evening with Charles's documents spread in front of him and worked through them with the systematic patience of a man dismantling a structure from the inside. After 40 minutes, he set down his pen. The arrangement between your father and Mr. Whitmore has no legal standing regarding your person or your property, he said to Adeline. Your mother's will is explicit, and your age at the time of any alleged agreement removes consent as a valid legal argument. He paused. However, Rhett said, say it. He's filed with a judge in Pima County, Judge Harold Eccles. Marsh looked at Rhett. Do you know that name? A beat. Yes, Rhett said. Adeline looked between them. Who is he? Marsh said. A man whose decisions have historically aligned with the interests of people who contribute to his political campaigns. He said it with the flat precision of someone stating a fact they find distasteful, but not surprising. Whitmore has already met with him, privately, before arriving here. The room was quiet. He went to the judge first, Clara said from the doorway, before he even came to town. Yes, Marsh said. The public speech today, the sympathy, the concern, the implications, that's theater. The real structure is already being built in the courtroom. He looked at Rhett. He can make this very messy for you specifically. Accusations of fraud in the original advertisement, of undue influence of... He glanced at the documents. He's using the word coercion in the formal filing. The word sat in the room like something dropped. Adeline said, That's... She stopped. He's saying Rhett coerced me. He's implying it strongly enough that a sympathetic judge can work with it, Marsh said. He doesn't need to prove it. He needs enough uncertainty to get a hearing, and with Eccles in place, a hearing is enough to do significant damage to Mr. Callahan's reputation and business standing while the case proceeds. How long would that take? Rhett said. 6 months. A year, possibly. Long enough to affect cattle contracts, banking relationships, the kind of business relationships that depend on reputation. Marsh paused. He's done this before. Different circumstances. Same architecture. Adeline's hands went still in her lap. She was looking at the table. Not at Rhett. At the table. Because she understood with perfect cold clarity what was happening. Charles had not come here simply to reclaim her. He had come here to make staying more expensive than leaving. He had come here to make Rhett pay the price for having taken her in to transform Rhett's defense of her into a liability to weaponize decency itself. He's going to destroy you, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He's going to try, Rhett said. Your cattle contracts. Your Adeline. I came here and I brought this to your door, and he's going to use it to take apart everything you've built. Adeline. His voice was quiet and absolute. Look at me. She looked up. His face was calm. Not the performed calm of a man concealing panic, the real kind, the kind built from the bedrock of a person who has made an irreversible decision and found it solid under his feet. This isn't your fault, he said. And it isn't a reason for anything except fighting back correctly. He'll drag your name through. Let him drag. Names clean up. He held her gaze. You don't. She stared at him. You cannot be traded, bargained, or scared back into something you already escaped, he said. Not while I'm here. That's the only thing that matters to me right now. Marsh, to his credit, was studying the documents with sudden, intense concentration. Clara was doing nothing of the kind. Clara was watching with the open, undisguised emotion of someone witnessing something they'd been hoping for and hadn't been certain would arrive. Charles came to the ranch on Saturday. He came alone, which was either confidence or strategy, and probably both. He had the particular ease of movement of a man who has decided how a conversation ends before it begins. Rhett met him in the yard. Adeline stood on the porch. Charles looked at her first. A long look, unhurried, the kind of look that was itself a form of assertion. Then he looked at Rhett. I'm prepared to make this simple, Charles said. Adeline returns with me voluntarily. I withdraw all filings. Your name stays intact, your business continues, and we all proceed as though this misunderstanding never occurred. Rhett said nothing. I have no personal grievance with you. Charles continued with the practiced reasonableness of a man who understands that appearing reasonable is more powerful than being right. You were misled by a woman who is quite skilled at presenting herself sympathetically. That's not your failure. He paused. But she does belong with me. Legally, financially, by prior arrangement. And by... She doesn't belong to you, Rhett said. She doesn't belong to anyone. Charles's smile adjusted slightly. I understand you feel strongly. I'm going to say this once, Rhett said. Clearly. You'll listen, and then you'll leave this property. He looked at Charles with the full, unobstructed weight of his attention. No anger which would have given Charles something to perform against just certainty. Whatever you filed in Pima County, my attorney is already responding to. Whatever influence you have with Eccles we're documenting and will be taking to the territorial governor's office within the week. Whatever you plan to say about me in this town, say it. I've been called worse by men I actually respected. He took a step forward. But understand this. You come near her again on my land in this town, anywhere in this territory, and the legal complications you're planning for me are going to feel insignificant compared to your other problems. Charles looked at him, really looked this time, without the performance. What he saw was something he had not calculated for a man who was not afraid of him. Not positioning, not managing, not calculating a response. Simply not afraid. The way certain walls aren't afraid of things thrown at them. The smile dimmed. You'll regret this, Charles said. Add it to the list, Rhett said. Charles left. The town divided harder after that. Word of the ranch meeting spread distorted, amplified, reframed at each retelling in the way of small towns where information is currency. By Sunday afternoon, the version circulating in the street bore little resemblance to what had actually happened, but it had the essential shape Rhett Callahan had refused to give the woman back. Which, depending on who was telling it, meant either that he was protecting someone who deserved protection or that he was proving the Chicago man's point. Mabel Pruitt gathered her 6 women and added 4 more. Adeline walked through it. She walked through the store, through the street, through the loaded silences, and the pulled-away gazes, and the 2 women who crossed to the other side of the road when they saw her coming. She walked through it with her spine straight, and her jaw level, and her eyes forward the same way she'd walked through 40 strangers on a train platform 6 weeks ago. But it cost more this time. Because this time, she had something to lose. She came back to the ranch that evening and sat on the porch alone for a long time, and for the first time in weeks, the nightmares came back while she was still awake, not sleep ghosts, but the waking kind, the calculations that a person makes when they're trying to measure the damage they cause against the cost of running. She thought about the cattle contracts, the banking relationships. 11 years of a reputation built by a man who had every reason to be bitter and had chosen to build something instead. She thought about Eli asking if they were going to get properly married. She thought about coffee outside her door. She thought about a man who fixed hinges that weren't broken. And then she thought, what if staying makes it worse? What if the only way to protect all of this is to remove the reason Charles is here? She sat with that thought for a long time. She did not want to run. She was so tired of running. But there is a particular shape of love early and uncertain, and still learning its own name, that looks at the person it belongs to and decides that their safety is more important than its own existence. She went inside. She did not pack loudly. She did not make noise. She moved through the dark house with the careful quiet of someone who has spent enough time not waking people to be good at it. And she pulled her worn suitcase from under the bed and she began. She had the dress folded first, then the extra boots. The book she'd been reading, she held it for a moment. Set it down. She wasn't taking it. She took the gloves. She stood in the dark room with the suitcase half packed and told herself this was the right thing. Told herself that leaving this one time for these reasons was different from every other time she'd run. Told herself that Rhett Callahan's life before she arrived was better than what she was bringing him now. She was halfway to convincing herself when the door opened. He hadn't knocked. She realized later that he probably hadn't been asleep at all. He stood in the doorway and looked at the suitcase on the bed, and then at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then something in Rhett Callahan that was never uncontrolled, that had been controlled through a war and the years afterward, and the long specific discipline of becoming a man, people feared, rather than someone who could be hurt, came entirely apart. He crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed the suitcase off the bed and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall and fell open, and everything inside it spilled across the floor, and the sound of it in the silent house was enormous. He turned back toward her, and his voice when he spoke was not quiet. It was raw, cracked at the center. The voice of a man who has held something very tightly for a very long time and cannot hold it anymore. You think I fought half this damn town just to let you walk away? She had not cried in front of him, not once since she arrived. She had cried quietly in the dark in her room alone, the way she'd learned to cry in a house where crying was weakness. She had brought it out only when she was certain no one was listening. But standing in that room with the suitcase contents spread across the floor and Rhett Callahan in front of her, with his composure finally completely gone, she could not hold it. She put her hands over her face, and the sound that came out of her was everything she'd been carrying since Chicago. Since before Chicago. Since a letter found in a desk drawer and a morning train out of the city and every mile of distance she'd put between herself and a life that had never been allowed to be hers. He crossed to her in one step and pulled her into him hard and immediate, the way a person holds on to something they almost lost without understanding they were losing it. His arms around her were not gentle. They were the opposite of gentle. They were the arms of a man who is holding what he is not going to let go of again. Nobody, he said into her hair, rough and absolute. Nobody is taking you anywhere. Do you hear me? She was crying too hard to answer. You don't run, he said. Not from this, not from me. If you leave someday, it's because you chose to not, because that man scared you into it. You don't give him that. She gripped the front of his shirt. I didn't want to go, she managed. I know what you thought. His voice dropped. You thought you were protecting me. He pulled back just enough to look at her face. Adeline, I don't need protecting. I need you to stay. She looked up at him, at a man who had survived a war and the years after it, and had built something in the canyon country of Arizona with his own hands and his own stubborn refusal to become less than he believed a person should be, at a man who had left coffee outside her door. Nobody has ever fought for me, she said. Not once, not ever. His hands came up to her face, careful now, deliberate the way he handled the things that mattered, and he looked at her with the full weight of what he'd never been able to say, and hadn't needed to because it was already in everything else. Get used to it, he said. She closed her eyes. And behind them both on the floor, the dress and the extra boots and the gloves he'd given her lay scattered across the boards where they had fallen. She wasn't picking them up to pack them. In the morning, she would put them back in the drawer. She was staying. And Charles Whitmore, who had spent 11 days building his architecture of pressure and public theater and legal maneuvering, had just made the single miscalculation that would define everything that came next. He had pushed hard enough to make her stop running, and a woman who stops running is a very different thing than a woman who is afraid. She did not leave. And Charles Whitmore, who had spent 11 days in Dry Creek waiting for the pressure to work, woke up the morning after his visit to the ranch and understood that the architecture of his plan had developed a crack he had not designed for. He responded the way men like him always respond when the quiet approach fails. He stopped being quiet. The sheriff of Dry Creek was a man named Dale Pruitt, no relation to Mabel, though they shared the same fundamental conviction that the established order of things was correct and that disturbances to it were a personal inconvenience. Dale had worn his badge for 9 years, with the particular comfort of a man who has learned that the job is mostly managing situations rather than resolving them, and who has come to prefer the former because resolution requires taking sides. Charles met with Dale on Sunday morning. No one saw the meeting, but everyone noticed what came after. Dale started asking questions around town about the legality of mail-order marriages under territorial law. He asked in the idle conversational manner of a man who is not investigating anything specifically, which was how everyone knew he was investigating something specifically. He stopped in at Fletcher's General Store and mentioned to no one and everyone that there were serious legal questions being raised about certain arrangements and that a responsible lawman had to take those concerns seriously. Rhett heard about this by Monday noon. He sat across from Marsh at the ranch table and did not say anything for a long moment. Marsh watched him with the cautious attention of a man measuring how much space to give. "He bought the sheriff," Rhett said. "Not necessarily purchased," Marsh said carefully. "Influenced. There's a legal distinction." "There's no practical distinction," Rhett said. He leaned back. "How long before Dale does something official? A week, maybe less." Marsh folded his hands on the table. "Charles is manufacturing a process. He doesn't need to win the case, Rhett. He needs the process to exist long enough to do damage. An inquiry from the local sheriff into the validity of your marriage, even a frivolous one, creates a public record. That record travels. And the people who do business with you read records like that and make decisions. My cattle contracts. 3 of them renew in the fall," Marsh said. "The ranchers involved are careful men. They won't want the association while there's public dispute about your personal—" "I understand what it means." Rhett stood, moved to the window without looking out of it. "He's not trying to win. He's trying to bleed." "Yes." A silence. "Then we stop him from having time to do it," Rhett said. "What does Marsh need to move faster?" "The governor's office connection you mentioned. I can have a meeting arranged by Wednesday." Marsh nodded. "And the documentation on Eccles, the evidence of prior contact with Whitmore." "My man in Tucson already has 3 names who witnessed that meeting," Rhett said. "I'll have it to you by tomorrow." Marsh looked at him with the measured appreciation of a man who has worked with many clients and is rarely surprised. "You prepared for this," he said. "I prepared for a lot of things when I was young and stupid," Rhett said. "Turns out the preparation held." Haroch. Adeline, meanwhile, had done something that nobody had asked her to do, and that turned out to be exactly the right thing. She had started talking. Not to Rhett, not to Marsh, to the town. Not with speeches. Not with the kind of public performance Charles was so skilled at. She talked the way she had been doing things since she arrived in Dry Creek, quietly, directly, and with the particular authority of someone who has nothing left to perform. She talked to Ruby's mother first, a woman named Agnes, who ran a tight household and had always reserved her judgment on Adeline, with the caution of someone who had learned not to form opinions too fast in a place where opinions cost. Adeline sat at Agnes's kitchen table with coffee and told her the truth. Not the sanitized version. The actual truth. Her father, the debts, the letter in the desk drawer, the train ticket bought with her mother's jewelry, all of it. Agnes listened without interrupting. When Adeline finished, Agnes sat for a moment. Then she said, "My first husband had debts too. Different kind. Same result." She looked at Adeline directly. "You're not what people said you were when you arrived." "No," Adeline said. "What you are is a woman who left before she got trapped," Agnes said, "which takes more nerve than most people give it credit for." Agnes talked to 4 women. Those 4 women talked to others. Not gossip, something different in texture, something that traveled with the weight of being verified, being real. By Thursday, the balance in Dry Creek had shifted another fraction. Mabel Pruitt noticed. She did not adjust her opinion. Mabel Pruitt had not adjusted an opinion in 30 years and was not about to start, but she became quieter about it, which was its own kind of retreat. Charles noticed too. Rhett saw him in the street on Thursday afternoon and registered the change in his posture. The calculation behind his eyes had accelerated. The careful patience of a man managing a process had given way to something sharper, less controlled. The plan was not moving at the pace he needed it to move, and the ground he'd expected to control was shifting. That was the moment Rhett became genuinely specifically concerned. Because a patient, Charles Whitmore was dangerous in a manageable way. A Charles Whitmore who felt his timeline slipping was something else entirely. He went home and told Adeline, "Don't go into town alone." She looked at him. "Rhett, I'm not telling you what to do," he said. "I'm telling you what I need. Take someone with you. Beaumont. One of the hands, Clara, anyone. Don't go alone." He held her eyes. Please. She heard the please. He did not say it often. All right, she said.
Sure.
She went alone on Friday. Not because she ignored him, because she forgot, or because the habit of independence is harder to suspend than intention, or because the morning felt ordinary in the specific way that ordinary mornings do before they become something else. Eli needed new bootlaces, the kind Fletcher kept in the back room, and it was a quick trip, a 10-minute trip, and she was back before anyone noticed she'd gone. She never made it back. She was 3 blocks from Fletcher's store when the man in the suit that didn't quite fit stepped out of the gap between 2 buildings. The third man, the one whose purpose at Charles's arrival had never been stated, came from the other direction. She didn't scream. She thought later that she should have screamed, that screaming was the obvious and correct response, but what happened in the first second was not fear. It was a pure electric rage, the kind that comes from being grabbed again after you believed you were past being grabbed. And she fought immediately, using everything she had, elbows and weight, and the deliberate damage that the months at the ranch had given her body back. But there were 2 of them, and she was one person, and they had a covered wagon waiting at the end of the alley. By the time anyone in Dry Creek understood something had happened, it was already over. Eli found her gloves. One of them dropped in the alley near the gap between the buildings. He found it while running an errand for Beaumont, and he stood holding it for a full moment with the 9-year-old's clear, uncluttered capacity for understanding exactly what something means. He ran. He ran the full distance from town to the ranch without stopping, which took 11 minutes and cost him the ability to speak coherently for another 2 minutes after he arrived, but which put the glove in Rhett's hand while there was still time. Rhett looked at the glove. He looked at Eli, who was bent double trying to breathe, and said, "Which way did the wagon go?" "East." Eli managed. "Out past the mill road. I saw it from the end of the street. East. Away from the rail line, away from town, away from anything that would be easily observed." Rhett was already moving. He went to the barn with his voice carrying 3 ranch hands' names in the tone that communicated the full situation without requiring explanation. He was saddled in under 4 minutes. By the time Clara appeared in the yard at a run, having heard the commotion from the house, he had a rifle across his saddle and his hat pulled low, and the expression on his face that made men step out of his way instinctively. "Rhett," Clara started. "Send word to Marsh," he said. "Tell him to have Dale Pruitt in front of a witness when this is over." He looked at her. "I'm bringing her back." "I know you are," Clara said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. "Rhett, don't do something that can't be undone." He looked at his sister for 1 second. "I know the difference," he said. And then he was gone, and the sound of horses at a dead run faded east into the canyon country, and Clara stood in the yard and listened until she couldn't hear it anymore. Pisky. The abandoned mining camp sat at the end of a dry creek bed 8 miles east of town, in a fold of canyon that a man who didn't know the territory would have ridden past without noticing. Rhett knew the territory. He had ridden it for 11 years. He knew every fold, every water source, every place a man might choose if he needed somewhere he wouldn't be looked for. He came in from the high ground above the camp, leaving the horses and the hands below, and taking the last quarter mile on foot, moving through the dark, with the particular quiet of a man who had done this before, in worse conditions, with worse stakes. He heard voices before he saw the camp. He heard Charles's voice, measured, controlled, the performance still intact, even here, saying, "You're going to be reasonable about this. The alternative is..." And then another sound, not Adeline's voice. A crash. A male grunt of pain. Another crash. Rhett came over the ridge and saw the camp, and stopped. One of the suited men was on the ground unconscious, his involvement in the evening clearly concluded. The second man was pressed against the wall of the mine structure, holding his forearm with both hands, blood showing dark between his fingers. Adeline was standing in the center of the camp. She had a knife, a short one, a working knife, the kind a woman keeps in her boot because she has learned to keep things in her boot, and she was holding it with the grip of someone who has never been trained and doesn't need to be, because training is optional when necessity is sufficient. Charles was 6 feet away from her, perfectly still, recalibrating everything he had believed about this situation. He had brought 2 men to manage a frightened woman. He had miscalculated. Rhett stood at the edge of the camp for a moment. Something happened in his chest that he did not have a complete word for. Not just relief, not just the release of the terror that had been driving him the past 3 hours, but something larger than either. The recognition of something he had known for weeks, but was seeing confirmed in the most irrevocable way possible. The woman he had been racing across the desert to save had not needed saving. Not entirely. Not in the way he'd feared. She had bought herself time. She looked up and saw him. Something moved across her face. Relief and anger and defiance all at once. None of it outcompeting the others, and she did not lower the knife. "You're late," she said. "I know," he said. He walked into the camp and came to stand beside her, and the ranch hands came in behind him and spread out around the edges, and the man against the wall made one assessment of the situation and decided his arm was the most important thing in his life at the moment. Charles looked at Rhett. "This is assault," Charles said. "Multiple witnesses. Your men can confirm the knife." "My men," Rhett said, "can confirm whatever they saw, which is a woman defending herself after being taken off the street by 2 hired men." He looked at Charles without blinking. "You want to have that conversation in front of a judge?" Charles's jaw tightened. The performance was still there. He was too practiced to lose it entirely, but something behind it had changed. The certainty. The absolute confidence that the outcome was already arranged. "She belongs to me legally," Charles said. The word legally was doing everything it could. The arrangement with her father. "The only thing she belongs to," Rhett said, his voice dropping to the register that ended conversations, "is herself." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Charles moved, not a retreat, something worse, a lunge forward with the desperate speed of a man abandoning strategy for damage, and Rhett met him. What happened next was not elegant. Rhett Callahan had grown up in a territory that did not produce elegant fighters. He had survived a war. He had spent 11 years managing land and men and situations that required absolute physical authority and the willingness to apply it. He was not a violent man in the way people assumed. He did not enjoy it, did not seek it, had spent considerable effort building a life that didn't require it, but he was very, very good at it when required. Charles landed one hit. It was a solid one. The man was not physically weak, whatever else he was, and it rocked Rhett back a step. Then Rhett put him on the ground and kept him there, and the fight stopped being a fight. It became something else, something that would have had no good ending if Adeline had not put her hand on Rhett's arm. "Stop," she said. He heard her. He was breathing hard, and the thing that had been driving him since Eli showed up with the glove was still fully engaged, still looking for an outlet, and the man on the ground was the reason for 8 miles of desperate riding in the dark. "Rhett," her hand on his arm, her voice steady. "Stop." He stopped. He pulled back and stood, and Charles stayed on the ground, and the camp was very quiet. "He's not worth it," she said. "Not what it costs you." She came to stand beside him, not between him and Charles, but beside him, her shoulder against his arm. "I need you here. After. I need you not to do something that takes you away from after." He looked at her. At her bare hands, she'd lost the gloves somewhere, or taken them off, and the knife still in her right hand, and the absolute grounded certainty in her face. She had fought her way to this moment. She was not going to let it be ruined by what happened next. "All right," he said. His voice was rough. "All right." He straightened fully, looked down at Charles. "You're done here," he said. "Everything you filed, everything you arranged, every judge you paid my attorney is already dismantling it. Your man in Pima County is going to have company from the territorial governor's office by the end of the week." He paused. "And what happened here tonight? The kidnapping, the hired men, the knife wound, you're going to try to explain that's a criminal matter in this territory, not a civil one." Charles looked up from the ground. The performance was gone. What remained was a man who had made a serious error in judgment and was beginning to understand its full dimensions. "You can't prove," Eli Cooper, Rhett said, "is 9 years old, and saw your wagon leave the alley. A 9-year-old's testimony in front of a sympathetic jury against a Chicago politician who came west and had a local woman taken off a public street. He let that settle. Try me. Charles said nothing. One of the ranch hands stepped forward and pulled him upright. And Charles went without resistance, and something in that going without resistance told Rhett more than anything else had about the actual state of things. Charles Whitmore, who had built his plan on the assumption that Adeline Brooks was a frightened woman and Rhett Callahan was a simple obstacle, had arrived in Dry Creek with a complete architecture and was leaving it with nothing. Not because the architecture had failed, because he had built it to contain something that no longer existed. Hooray! They rode back in the dark. She was beside him. He'd given her his horse and taken one of the hands, and they rode in the particular quiet of people who have been through something together and are still processing the shape of it. After a while, she said, "The knife was from my boot." "I know. I've been carrying it since the 2nd week." A pause. "I didn't tell you." "I know that too." He glanced at her. "You were managing your own risks." "Yes. He considered. "That's the right thing to do. You shouldn't need my permission to keep a knife." She was quiet for a moment. "Most men would be bothered by it." "Most men," he said, "haven't watched you use one." Something almost like a laugh crossed her face. Small, exhausted reel. "I was afraid," she said, "when they put me in that wagon. I want you to know that. I wasn't brave. I was terrified and angry, and the anger was louder than the fear, so I used it." "That's what brave is," he said. "I thought brave was not being afraid." "No," he said. "Brave is being afraid and moving anyway. You've been doing it since the moment you stepped off that train." She looked at him in the dark. "Rhett," she said. I'm not leaving." She said it simply, plainly, like a thing that needed to be said out loud for the last time and then put away. "Not ever. Not for him, not for what he cost you, not for anything that isn't my own choice. I'm not leaving." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I know." "You know. You walked back into that room last night and put your things away," he said. "You already told me." She had forgotten he'd seen that. She looked at the canyon ahead of them, the stars overhead, the red rock country she'd come to know in a matter of weeks, the way she'd never known anywhere in years. "Your cattle contracts," she said. "Being managed. Your reputation survived worse." Charles. "Being arrested," he said. "Marsh has Dale Pruitt and 2 witnesses in a room right now. By the time we get back, the formal complaint will be filed." He paused. The kidnapping of a woman off a public street supersedes every civil filing he made, regardless of what Eccles wants to do with it. And the territorial governor's office does not like being embarrassed by politicians who overreach into their jurisdiction. She absorbed this. "You planned for all of it," she said. "I planned for him doing something stupid," Rhett said. "Desperate men always do. I just needed to know which direction the stupid was coming from." "And the direction was me," she said, not bitterly, just accurately. "The direction was the thing he couldn't control," Rhett said, "which was you choosing to stay." She rode beside him in silence for another mile. Then she said, "When he said I belonged to him legally, when he said that—" "I heard you stop me," Rhett said. "I heard you. I stopped." "I stopped you because I meant what I said," she said. "Not because I was protecting him. He doesn't deserve protecting." She looked at Rhett directly. "I stopped you because you matter more than he does, and a man who kills for me carries something he shouldn't have to carry." Rhett was quiet for a long moment. "You've thought about this before," he said. "I've thought about a lot of things," she said. "I have extensive experience with long rides and difficult thoughts." He looked at her, then tired and straight-backed and entirely herself, the woman who had come off a train with one suitcase and refused to look down, who had put a knife in her boot during her 2nd week and said nothing, who had fought 2 men in an abandoned mining camp and was now discussing the ethics of violence with the calm of someone who has reached the far side of something and found it solid under her feet. "Adeline," he said. She looked at him. "Marry me." He said it without preamble or ceremony, the way he said everything that mattered. "Actually, not the paper, not the arrangement. You and me in front of whoever you want present with whatever words you want said." He paused. "Because you're not a mail order anything, and I'm done letting that word exist in the same sentence as your name." She looked at him for a long moment. The stars were very thick above the canyon. "Yes," she said, not quietly, not with hesitation or calculation or any of the careful management that had governed everything for so long. Just yes, clean and clear and certain. He nodded once as though she'd confirmed something he'd already known and looked back at the trail ahead. But she saw his hands relax on the reins, saw the set of his shoulders change, saw a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, not the threat, not the fight, not Charles Whitmore and his lawyers and his bribed judges, but the uncertainty, the not knowing if she'd stay. Put it down, and ride easier for the first time in weeks. Behind them, the mining camp and everything that had happened in it was already becoming the past. Ahead, the ranch sat in its canyon, waiting with coffee in the kitchen and a 9-year-old who would need to be told everything immediately, and a sister who would say she knew it all along. She was going home. Not back. Home. And there was nothing temporary about it anymore. They rode back into the ranch yard just past midnight. Clara was on the porch. She had been on the porch, Rhett suspected, since the moment he'd left. She stood with her arms crossed and her chin level watching them come in. And the only indication that the last 3 hours had cost her anything was the way her exhale, when she saw Adeline whole and upright in the saddle, was long enough to suggest she'd been holding it since sundown. She said nothing until Adeline had dismounted and come to the bottom of the porch steps. Then Clara came down those steps and put her arms around her hard and sudden without ceremony. Adeline went still for just a moment, the reflexive surprise of someone unaccustomed to being reached for, and then held on. "Don't do that again," Clara said into her shoulder. "I didn't exactly plan." "I know." Clara pulled back. She looked at Adeline's face, assessing, cataloging the same way she did everything. "Are you hurt?" "No." "The men who took you. One has a broken nose," Adeline said. "The other needs a doctor for his arm." Clara processed this, looked at the knife handle visible at Adeline's boot, looked back at her face. "Good," she said with full sincerity. Then she looked past Adeline to Rhett. "Charles." "In custody," Rhett said. "Marsh has it." "Dale Pruitt." "Sitting in a room with 2 witnesses and a criminal complaint that is significantly above his capacity to manage," Rhett said. "He'll hand it up by morning." Clara nodded once, the nod of someone checking boxes on an internal list. Then she said, "Eli cried." Rhett stopped moving. "He won't tell you that," Clara said. "He'll deny it completely and probably claim he had dust in his eyes for an extended period. But I'm telling you because you should know." She looked at Adeline. "He cried, and he made me promise not to tell anyone, and he sat on the kitchen floor with the dog for 2 hours waiting." Adeline's jaw tightened. Not with grief, with something deeper than grief. The kind of feeling that arrives when you understand for the first time the full weight of what you mean to people who didn't tell you they needed you. "Where is he?" she said. "Asleep," Clara said. "Finally, an hour ago." She paused. "He'll want to hear everything in the morning, every detail. He'll probably want to reenact it." "He can have every detail," Adeline said. She went inside, and Rhett stood in the yard for a moment longer, listening to the ranch settle around him. The horses, the night sounds, the particular alive quiet of a place where people are sleeping safely, and felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could accurately calculate. Not relief. Relief was too temporary, too surface-level a word for it. Something that lived underneath relief. Something that felt against every expectation he had built his life around like enough. Charles Whitmore's case moved faster than he'd expected and slower than he'd hoped. The criminal complaint kidnapping assault conspiracy to coerce went up from Dry Creek to the territorial court within 48 hours, which removed it from Dale Pruitt's reluctant management and placed it squarely in front of a judge who had no prior relationship with Charles and no interest in developing one. The territorial governor's office, alerted by Marsh, through a contact Rhett had spent 11 years never needing until now, sent a representative to Tucson by the end of the week. Judge Eccles, it turned out, had overestimated both Charles's influence and his own insulation from consequences. When the governor's representative arrived with documentation of the private meeting and the prior filings, Eccles did what men in his position invariably do when the mathematics changes. He reconsidered his position with remarkable speed and thoroughness. The civil filings Charles had brought, the contested marriage, the coercion implications, all of it collapsed without the judicial cooperation that had been their foundation. Without Eccles, without Dale Pruitt's compliance, without the leverage he'd expected to apply to Rhett's business relationships, Charles Whitmore had a criminal charge, a territory he was no longer welcome in, and a reputation that was traveling east ahead of him on the telegraph wire. He did not fight extradition. He left on a Thursday in a different hired coach with considerably less ceremony than his arrival had carried. Marsh accompanied the process personally and sent Rhett a telegram when the coach cleared territorial limits. 2 words: he's gone. Rhett read the telegram at the kitchen table and set it down and went back to his breakfast. Adeline watched him from across the table. "That's it," she said. "That's it." She looked at the telegram, at those 2 words doing 11 weeks of work in a single line. "I expected to feel more," she said slowly, "when it was over." "What do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Hungry," she said. "I feel hungry. I missed breakfast yesterday, and I'd like eggs." He looked at her for a moment. Then he got up and made eggs. And that, in its own quiet way, was the most complete answer either of them had for what came after. The town shifted the way towns shift, not all at once, not with any dramatic declaration, but in accumulated small adjustments that eventually add up to a different landscape. Agnes, who had listened to Adeline at her kitchen table and believed her had talked to the right people in the right tone. The story that circulated now was not the one Charles had constructed, the vulnerable woman, the manipulative rancher, the concerned civic-minded visitor from Chicago, but the one that was actually true and actual truth. Once it starts moving in a small town, is difficult to stop. Mabel Pruitt did not apologize. Mabel Pruitt was constitutionally incapable of apology, which was a fact everyone, including Mabel, had long since accepted. But she stopped. The active campaigning, the gathered women, the loud opinions voiced in doorways, it stopped. And in the particular social mathematics of Dry Creek, Mabel Pruitt, going silent, was as close to a public retraction as the town was going to produce. Fletcher, who had addressed Adeline as Mrs. Callahan since the day Rhett had his brief private conversation about courtesy and consequences, began asking her opinion on supply scheduling. She gave it. He used it. He never acknowledged either of these things directly, which was exactly the kind of credit she had learned to accept from men like Fletcher without requiring anything more formal. The hands at the ranch, who had never needed the town's opinion to form their own, were simply quietly satisfied. Beaumont won the bet, which turned out to be a modest amount of money, collected from 7 participants who had underestimated the timeline. He accepted it without comment and added an extra serving to everyone's supper that evening without explaining why. Eli, true to Clara's prediction, demanded the full account of the mining camp in exact detail, questioned every decision for strategic alternatives, and ultimately decided that Adeline's use of the knife had been optimal and that he personally intended to learn this skill as soon as someone agreed to teach him. "Ask Clara," Adeline told him. Clara, when asked, taught him. She was an excellent teacher. She had strong opinions about where a knife should be kept and how it should be held, and she conveyed them with the direct efficiency of someone who has thought seriously about practical matters and finds people who haven't mildly exhausting. The wedding happened on the last Saturday of the month. Not large. Not formal in the Eastern sense, no hall hired, no engraved invitations, no occasion designed to impress anyone who wasn't already there. Adeline had been asked what she wanted, and had said without much deliberation the people who were here. No one who wasn't. So, it was Agnes and her husband. It was Beaumont, who wore his one good vest and considered this a significant personal concession. It was the ranch hands cleaned up and slightly uncomfortable in the way of men who are unaccustomed to standing still for ceremonial purposes. It was Ruby who had asked 3 days in advance what she should wear and had taken the answer seriously. It was Eli who wore his regular clothes because no one had thought to specify otherwise and who stood beside Rhett with the self-appointed gravity of someone who considers himself essential to proceedings. It was Clara who stood on Adeline's side and held her hand before the words started, and did not cry, which cost her more effort than anything else she did that day. The words themselves were simple. The pastor from the next town over read them plainly, and they answered plainly, and when it was done, it was done. Rhett held her hand through the whole of it. Afterward, in the yard, Eli said, "That was faster than I expected." "That's generally the goal," Rhett said. There wasn't any cake. Beaumont made pie. Eli considered this. Pie is acceptable, he decided. Adeline laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes out of the body before the mind decides whether to allow it genuine and sudden and full, and it caught Rhett mid-turn, so that he saw the whole of it, and what moved across his face in that moment was something he couldn't have named and didn't try to. He just looked at her. And kept looking. The way a man looks at something he still can't entirely believe is real. Heck, the first change came the week after. It started with a woman named Helen, who arrived at the ranch gate on a Tuesday morning with 2 children and a single bag, and the expression of someone who has made a decision at the very end of their capacity to keep waiting. She had heard through Agnes through the network that had been quietly forming in the weeks since Adeline's truth had started traveling that the Callahan Ranch was a place where a woman in difficulty might find practical help rather than public judgment. She had heard correctly. Adeline brought her inside. She sat with Helen for 2 hours. She asked the right questions and listened to the answers and did not flinch at any of it, and at the end, she went to find Rhett. "She needs a place," Adeline said. "A few weeks, until she can arrange for her sister in New Mexico to receive her." Rhett looked at her, then passed her toward the main house. "The east room's empty," he said. "I know." "She can have it," he said. Adeline looked at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. I thought you might want to discuss it." "What's there to discuss?" He went back to what he'd been doing. "She needs the room. The room's empty. If she can do useful work while she's here, that's a benefit. If she can't, the room's still empty either way." She watched him for a moment. "Rhett Callahan," she said. He looked up. "You are not what people think you are," she said. "People think a lot of things," he said, and looked back down. But she saw the line of his shoulders and the way he very deliberately did not smile, and she went back to the house to help Helen settle the children into the east room. Helen stayed 3 weeks. She was handy with horses and helped in the corrals. When she left for New Mexico, she took a letter of introduction from Adeline addressed to 3 women she knew there, and she cried at the gate for long enough that Eli became visibly uncomfortable and looked at Rhett, who told him without looking up that crying was occasionally necessary and that the correct response was to look elsewhere and give a person room. Eli looked elsewhere. He filed this information carefully. 2 weeks after Helen left, another woman came, then 2 more. Then a family passing through with nothing. The particular Arizona Territory variety of nothing that means winter is coming, and there is no plan for it. They stayed. They worked. They moved on when they were ready, or in some cases, they didn't move on at all. The school was Adeline's idea, shaped during the long evenings when she'd watch Ruby and Eli and Sims work through their reading by firelight, and think about the other children on neighboring properties who had no such evenings, no such time set aside, no one for whom their education was the final business of the day. She brought it to Rhett on a Wednesday over breakfast, laid out with the specific precision of someone who had prepared for possible resistance and intended to be thorough. He listened to the whole presentation. Then he said, "The South Building isn't being used." She blinked. "I know, but I thought—" "It'll need work," he said. "The floor is bad in the eastern half. I can have the hands fix it this week." She set down her fork. "You're not going to argue about it." "What would I argue?" he said. "Children need schooling. You want to provide it. We have the space." He looked at her. "Was I supposed to need convincing? Most men." "You keep expecting me to be most men," he said. "We've been married 2 months. You should know better by now." She stared at him. Then she picked her fork back up and said, "The floor needs to be fixed by Friday. I'm starting Monday." "I'll tell the hands today," he said. The South Building was ready by Thursday. Adeline started with 6 children. Within a month, she had 11. Within 2 months, she had enough that she wrote to a teacher's college in Tucson, requesting materials, and the letter she wrote was precise and authoritative, and knowledgeable enough that the college responded with both materials and a question about whether she had formal teaching credentials, because they had been hoping to expand their territory outreach, and her letter demonstrated the kind of pedagogical instinct that was difficult to train. She wrote back and said she didn't have formal credentials. She received a second letter offering her the opportunity to pursue them through correspondence. She brought this letter to Rhett on a Sunday evening. He read it twice. Then he looked at her with the expression that she had come to understand as his version of pride, not showy, not performed, simply present a deep specific satisfaction that lived in the eyes. "Do it," he said. "It takes 2 years." "So it takes 2 years. I'd be doing coursework in the evenings." "Adeline," he said. "Do it." She looked at him. At this man who had fixed a hinge that wasn't broken and made coffee every morning and ridden 8 miles in the dark without hesitating, and said the only thing she belongs to is herself, with enough certainty to stop a room. "All right," she said. She did it. The twist that nobody saw coming arrived 6 months after Charles Whitmore's departure in the form of a letter from Marsh. It concerned Adeline's mother's estate. The full accounting which Charles had controlled through his management of her father's affairs, and had never allowed to be properly audited, turned out to be significantly larger than Adeline had believed when she'd left Chicago. The jewelry she'd sold in the pawn shop had been the smallest fraction of what her mother had left her. The property, the holdings, the careful arrangements a cautious woman had made over a lifetime of understanding that the men around her might not always be trustworthy, it was substantial. Charles had been managing it, technically, through instruments that were Marsh explained in the careful language of a lawyer who has found something infuriating just inside the legal boundary. With Charles removed from the picture, the full estate transferred to Adeline's sole control. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she put it on the table in front of Rhett. He read it. He set it down. "Your mother," he said, "was a very thorough woman. She always said money was protection," Adeline said quietly. "I thought she meant money was comfort. She meant exactly what she said." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do with it?" She had already thought about this in the hour between the letter's arrival and sitting down across from him. She had thought about it with the specific clarity that comes when the answer is already inside you and you're just waiting for permission to trust it. "The refuge," she said. "More space, properly funded. And the school a real building, not the South storage room, with supplies and materials and someone else to teach alongside me when I'm finished with the coursework." She paused. "And a fund, for women who arrive with nothing, the way I arrived with almost nothing, so they have a start." He looked at her across the table. "And the ranch," he said. "It's your money. You can—" "The ranch is ours," she said. Simply, plainly, like a thing that does not require elaboration. He held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said. "Dig." The spring came, and with it, the kind of change that builds so gradually you only see it when you look back. The South Building became a proper schoolhouse. The east wing of the main house was expanded to receive women passing through, and 2 of those women had stayed and become part of the ranch's permanent life. One running the kitchen alongside Beaumont with a competence that he initially resisted and then enthusiastically embraced. One working the horses with a skill that made Rhett revise several of his assumptions about what he'd thought he knew. Eli turned 10 and developed opinions about everything with even greater confidence than before. Ruby finished her reading primer and started on the next level with the solemn intensity of someone who has decided that knowledge is a project to be completed. Sims, who had been the quiet one, discovered that he had a gift for numbers that made Adeline's eyes go wide the first time she understood the extent of it, and she wrote to Tucson about him specifically. The hands who had watched all of this from the beginning said little about it to outsiders, but among themselves in the bunkhouse in the evenings, there was a consensus that had been forming for months and that had solidified into something they considered simply true. The ranch was different now. Better different. The kind of different that happens when a place that had been functioning becomes something that's also alive. Rhett was different too. Not changed, that wasn't the right word. He was entirely recognizably himself. He was still the man who made decisions without elaborate consultation and meant what he said the first time and expected others to do the same. He was still the man who resolved problems with the particular directness of someone who considers extended negotiation an inefficient use of available time. But he laughed more. Not often. He was not a man who laughed easily, and that would not change. But when it happened, it was real, and it reached his eyes, and it was usually connected to something Adeline had said or done, or the particular chaos that a ranch full of children and their questions produced on any given afternoon. He slept through the night. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he woke in the morning, and the first thought was not the list of problems requiring management. The first thought was simply here. This. The ranch. The people in it. The woman in the room across the hall, who had become, without his planning for it, or particularly trying to stop it, the organizing fact of his life. He slept through the night and woke up thinking about the day ahead, and found it, against all his previous experience, something to look forward to. Chink! She found him on the porch one evening in late spring. The sky doing what Arizona skies do when they decide to be generous, burning orange and deep red, and a purple that had no business being that beautiful. And she came out and sat beside him, and they were quiet together, in the particular comfortable quiet of people who have stopped needing to fill the space. After a while she said, "Can I ask you something?" "You always ask before you ask," he said. "You never actually need permission." "It's a habit," she said. "I'm working on it." She turned to look at him. "When exactly did you decide I was yours?" He looked at her. The question sat between them with the particular weight of something that has been understood for a long time and is only now being said in words. "You know when," he said. "I want to hear you say it." He was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, just taking the time that something true deserves. "The platform," he said. "First glance." She held his gaze. "You didn't know anything about me." "No," he agreed. "I could have been anyone." "You could have," he said. "But you weren't. You were you." He looked at her with the full, unobstructed weight of it, no management, no control, just the thing itself. "You walked through 40 people staring at you, and your eyes didn't drop. That's all I needed." She was quiet for a moment. "It took me longer," she said. "I know. I didn't trust it. I didn't trust." "I know," he said again. "You had better reasons than most people not to trust it." He looked out at the sky. "You got there." "I got there," she agreed softly. He reached over without looking and put his hand over hers on the armrest of the chair. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that while the sky finished its business with the colors. From inside the house came the sound of Eli arguing a point with Clara loudly, passionately, without apparent concern for the time of evening, and Ruby's voice adding a calmer counterpoint, and Beaumont's deep dissenting rumble from the direction of the kitchen, and underneath all of it, the particular background texture of a house full of people who are exactly where they belong. "Rhett," she said. I want you to know something." He looked at her. "I came here running," she said. "I came here with one suitcase and a broken clasp, and I was so tired I couldn't have told you what I was hoping for. I just knew I needed somewhere to stop." She looked at their joined hands. "I didn't know I was looking for this. I didn't know this was something I was allowed to look for." He waited. "I'm not running anymore," she said. "I haven't been for a long time. But I want you to know it's not because I'm tired of running or because you stopped the thing I was running from." She met his eyes. "I stopped because there's nowhere I'd rather be than here. That's different. That's a choice." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "it is." "I choose this," she said. "Every morning. I chose it yesterday, and I'm choosing it now, and I'll choose it tomorrow." He raised her hand and pressed it briefly to his jaw. Not a kiss. Exactly, something more fundamental than that contact and acknowledgement, and the full weight of what he could not always find words for, and then set it down again. "I know," he said. He said it the way he said everything that mattered. Quiet. Absolute. Like something that has been true long enough that saying it again is simply confirmation. In the months that followed, Dry Creek changed the way places change when the people inside them decide to become better than their worst instincts. Agnes organized a formal women's network. Nothing grand in name, simply practical in function, that connected women across 3 counties, with resources, with information, with the understanding that difficulty was not shameful and that need was not weakness. She modeled it. She told people privately on the way. Adeline Callahan had sat at her kitchen table and told the truth without performing it. The schoolhouse produced its first student who went on to a college program, Sims 12 years old by then, whose talent with numbers had been noticed by the right people at the right time. He came back to visit on holidays and sat in the kitchen with Adeline doing the coursework she was still working through and arguing about methodology with the specific, enjoyable stubbornness of someone who has been taught that his opinion deserves to be heard. Eli grew up. It happened fast the way things do when you're watching them. He became a young man who was opinionated and direct and not afraid of difficult conversations or difficult work. And if some of the credit for those qualities belonged to a woman who had modeled them in front of him every day from the age of 9, he never said so directly. But he kept the glove, the one he'd found in the alley. He kept it in his room, and when Adeline discovered this years later and asked him about it, he shrugged in the way of a young man who is not about to be emotional about something if he can possibly avoid it, and said it was useful for remembering what fast action looks like. She left him with it. And on the porch, where all the important things between them eventually found their way to words, Rhett Callahan sat in the evenings with the woman who had arrived with everything worth bringing, in one worn suitcase, and watched the territory they had made into something neither of them had been brave enough to plan for. A home. Not the building, the people. Not the land, the life. He had been alone before she arrived in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people around him, and everything to do with the particular empty quiet of a man who has stopped believing anything is coming that's worth waiting for. He was not alone now. He was not ever going to be alone again. And the woman who had been called a mail-order bride by people who believed a label was the same thing as a truth, who had walked through their judgment with her eyes level and her spine straight and chosen every single day the life she wanted over the story they'd assigned her, sat beside him and held his hand, and knew with the complete, unshakable certainty of someone who has finally truly arrived. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because someone put her there, because she chose it. And that made all the difference.